This is Insight with me, Haslinda Amin. We're live from the 18th Barclays Asia Forum here in Singapore, where policymakers, business leaders and investors are discussing the biggest forces shaping global markets and economies. The hot topic, of course, Donald Trump's political comeback and his picks for cabinet roles in the new administration. Here's what some of our guests have been saying about the impact on markets and trade.
For those world leaders, they have a relationship with President Trump, and I think they're probably thankful that President Trump won. It brings greater stability around the world, but it also sends a very clear message that America won't be pushed around. And also when it comes to economic issues like trade and others, this president wants to negotiate.
While I'm reasonably convinced that volatility is going to be higher, the precise direction is a lot harder to predict, right? Some of it depends upon whether some of the policy expectations we have are more rhetoric and less likely to actually translate into policy.
And we have much more ahead this hour, including an exclusive conversation with PAG co-founder and executive chairman Weijian Shan. And we'll look at Trump's likely impact on global security and trade with Finland's ex-prime minister and former U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry. While President-elect Trump's cabinet picks may increase tensions between the U.S. and China, Senator Marco Rubio has been tapped for Secretary of State, but he is sanctioned by Beijing. And Trump's pick for National Security Advisor Mike Waltz has declared that the two countries are in fact in a Cold War. Still, our next guest says a deeper trade battle may give China a much-needed push to boost domestic consumption. Weijian Shan is co-founder and executive chairman of PAG, which manages assets of more than $55 billion. Weijian, good to have you with us.
Thank you very much for having me.
Glass half full.
In what ways? Glass half full. When you say glass half full, in what ways?
Well, you're saying that there's still opportunities for China despite, what Trump may bring to the table, like the 60% tariffs, perhaps?
I think
Is it forcing China's hand?
I think the focus is very much on trade. But China is a very big economy, and it has been in a trade war with the United States for the past 6 years. We have to remember that the trade war started in the first Trump administration. And with the history behind us, we can see the effect of that trade war on the U.S. economy and on the Chinese economy and on trade. The truth of the matter is that the trade war has not achieved its stated purposes of reducing the U.S. trade deficit or stifling China's economic growth. China's exports to the United States as a percentage of American imports have declined from about 20% to about 14% at this particular point. However, China's share in global trade, or actually global exports, has increased from about 12% to 15%. And China's manufacturing value added has also increased as a share of global total from 27% to about 30%. So what happened? What happened is some productions have shifted out of China to, let's say, Southeast Asia, where we are at this moment, and to India. So in the past 6 years, these countries have substantially increased their exports to the United States. But their imports of intermediate products from China have far exceeded their exports of finished products to the United States. So if you look at the big picture, you would find the U.S. trade deficit has not come down, and China's total exports have not come down. It's just that the trade pattern has shifted. If that's the track record, you can think about what's going to happen if tariffs are going up. I think that would shift the trade pattern just some more. With regard to the Chinese economy, I think China is too dependent on exports anyway. And China was weaning itself from dependence on exports starting from 2007. At that time, exports represented about 36% of China's GDP. By 2018, when the trade war started, that ratio came down from 36% to 18%. But since 2020, it has crept up back to about 20% today. And the reason for that is domestic consumption is too low, and China needs to increase domestic demand, private consumption. So this escalating trade war probably will force China to focus on its domestic market.
As you said, China's share of the global trade has increased since the trade war between the US and China, but it is a different China today compared to before when the trade war first started. It is a weakened China. As you talked about consumption, surely even consumption will be impacted if the Trump administration were to impose additional tariffs on China.
Not on the domestic consumption. It will affect Chinese exports. There's no question about it. The weakness of the Chinese economy at this moment is weak domestic demand or private consumption. You see, in the United States, private consumption accounts for about 68% of GDP. For China, last year, it was 39.2%, just about 39%, way behind the United States. So China has depended on investments whose ratio is 20 percentage points higher than the United States, and on exports. So why private consumption is so weak? It is because China is in the middle of housing prices. With falling housing prices and with a bear stock market, there's negative household wealth effect, which depresses consumption, private consumption. So what China should do is to stimulate its economy, stabilize its housing sector and the stock market, and then to encourage private consumption. And I think the deterioration in the export market would force China's hands to focus more on domestic consumption.
Well, the stimulus we've seen so far is targeted at exactly that, consumption. Obviously, it's not doing enough. What is enough? What would you like to see? Some suggesting that perhaps QE is the way to go for China.
Well,
might it be forced to do that?
They did actually a round of QE, which surprised the market on September 24th of this year when they announced a monetary package to stimulate the economy, cutting interest rates, cutting reserve ratios, that is, the amount of deposits banks keep with central bank, cutting mortgage rates, and that package was actually quite significant. Again, taking the market by surprise. On the pleasant side, they announced some fiscal package on November the 5th, which has somewhat disappointed the market. I think that the policymakers have shifted their policy direction and policy attitude from trying to cool down the housing market. And this housing crisis is largely policy-induced because they try to cool down the property market to stabilizing the property market. And we have seen the results of it. Since that time, since October the 1st, in fact, home sales have increased substantially. Year on year, about 10% in October, and month over month, about 60%. So we're seeing some early results of the stimulus package. Is it enough? I think that the market hopes there will be more. The physical package was about 12 trillion RMB, or that's about 1.7 trillion US dollars, mostly focused on local government debt, to relieve their debt burden. The market expects more. My thinking is that if the policymakers have made up their mind to stabilize the housing market and the stock market, then they will have to own it. And they will have to issue more policies to support the market.
Do you see that happening? And linked to that, if you're optimistic, where are the opportunities? I mean, you've said before that the buyout landscape in China is a buyer's market. I mean,
Correct.
How are you looking at that now?
Well, it's too early to see some meaningful changes. Of course, the stock market reacted very quickly. Housing market is following. But as I said, the market expects more to fundamentally turn around confidence and expectations. You see, there's only so little or so much that the government can do. $1.7 trillion is a relatively small amount. If you look at what the households have done in the past 3 years, in 2022, households' deposits with the banks went up about $2.5 trillion. Last year, $2.5 trillion. So far this year, $1.7 trillion. Household savings in the past 3 years have increased at about 14% per year, whereas disposable income, less than 6%. So people are very reluctant to spend because they don't have the confidence, and there's negative wealth effects with falling housing prices and stock market, and the expectation was not there for the market to turn around. So you need very bold, aggressive stimulus packages to turn around that confidence. And then that would encourage people to take money out of their bank accounts and to spend it. And it's a huge amount.
Right.
Household deposits in China now amounts to, this is commercial bank household deposits, very low yielding, maybe 1% interest rates. It amounts to about $20 trillion, bigger than the GDP. So if you can unlock that spending power, it's much larger than whatever the government can do.
So it needs to go big and bold, encourage consumption. Weijian, thank you so much for that.
Yeah.
Weijian Shan, co-founder and executive chairman at PAG. Now, still to come, Donald Trump taps a skeptic on support for Ukraine as director of U.S. intelligence. We'll discuss the implications with former Finnish Prime Minister Sanna Marin next. Keep it here with us. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back. You're watching Insight. Donald Trump's second term has been dominated by discussions here at the Barclays Asia Forum in Singapore. Trump has moved swiftly to fill his cabinet, announcing multiple nominations in recent days. His latest picks include former Democrat Tulsi Gabbard, who's set to coordinate the nation's spy agencies. Like Trump, Gabbard has expressed skepticism of America's defense of Ukraine. Let's discuss this and more with former Finnish Prime Minister Sanna Marin. She was Finland's leader from 2019 to 2023, and at one point was the world's youngest prime minister. Sanna, good to have you with us.
Thank you so much, and good morning.
Good morning. We know that there's apprehension around the world awaiting for Trump's policies, but we know during his first administration, relations with Europe pretty strained, and I can only imagine Europe is on tenterhooks.
Of course, Europe was watching the elections very closely, and I think the general atmosphere is wakeful because we don't know yet what the policy is going to be. Of course, there has been some worrying statements from Mr. Trump, especially concerning Ukraine and NATO before the elections. But of course, now we are waiting. Are these the policies that he's going to drive as a president as well? As a former European leader, I hope the strong presence of United States in Ukraine. We need strong United States in the center of global politics and also in Europe, in Ukraine, helping. So I only hope that Donald Trump will continue the policies that Biden had concerning Ukraine.
Is it fair to assume that Europe was actually rooting for Harris?
Well, I think that it's not for us Europeans to say what should be the outcome of elections in another country. the people have voted. I think the results were very clear. It was more clear that we anticipated. We thought that it might be a more close race, but the results were very clear. I think Donald Trump has a strong mandate, and now we are waiting what the policy is going to be. And we need strong US, as I mentioned. We also need a strong NATO presence. So I only hope that the policies being in the center of international politics will continue, and we won't see the withdrawal from international community that we saw before in the first term of President Trump.
As you talked about NATO, we acknowledge that Trump did indicate that he was interested in pulling out of NATO. The question really is, will it be any different this time around? And what kind of negotiations, conversations can happen? Some have suggested that Mr. Rutz, for instance, would be able to have those conversations with Trump on an equal keel.
Well, I think this needs to be a wake-up call for Europe. We need to be more strong ourselves, and we need to be better partners. One thing that I do agree with Trump is that European countries need to raise their defense budgets up to the 2%, where actually Finland, my country, is already, because we have that aggressive neighbor. We have the longest land border with Russia in all EU countries, and we feel the threat of Russia. So I think we need to boost up our defense capabilities, our defense budgets, and Europe needs to be more strong and better partner in NATO as well. So in that perspective, I think this needs to be a wake-up call for Europe to build our own strategic autonomy, our capabilities in defense, in energy, and especially in new technologies that I really worry right now. Is Europe lagging behind? Are we doing enough? Because we cannot only be dependent on US or China in the future. We need to build our own capabilities.
And of course, it's something that President Macron himself has been pushing for. Let's take a look at Ukraine. It is front and center. Trump has said that he can solve or resolve at least the conflict in 24 hours. How are you assessing how perhaps the Trump administration can play a part in finding a solution?
Well, I don't think that President Trump will solve this conflict, this war, in 24 hours. It's very complex, and the situation on ground is very severe. I have visited Ukraine many times since the war has started, during the Prime Minister and also after that, and the situation is very grave. I think there's always a momentum of peace, but the peace needs to come in Ukraine's terms, and we need to support them, give them everything that they need, the arms support, financial support, humanitarian support that Ukrainians need, and then it's up to them. What are the terms of peace that they can agree on? And then we need to only support them to have as big and as steady negotiating status as possible, so that they can have a strong position concerning negotiations with Russia.
Are you concerned how Trump might be navigating the crisis in Ukraine, because he does have pretty good relations with Putin?
We shall see what he will do. I think it's always good to have connections. It's good to have that kind of discussion lines, but still, it's about Ukraine's future. And as a former leader of a smaller country, I don't want to see the world where big players or big, strong countries are agreeing and deciding behalf of smaller countries. We have to follow the international rule. We have to obey the agreements that we have all agreed on. So I think it's up to Ukraine what are the terms for peace, and bigger countries cannot agree and make decisions above countries that are involved.
The US is the only superpower left in the world. How reliable is the US as an ally for Europe? How are you assessing that?
Well, as I said, we need strong US, and we need strong US presence internationally. I see that there is...
Wasn't it a strong US under the Biden administration?
I think it was. In the first Trump administration, we saw some withdrawal from the international community and some worrying statements concerning the international cooperation. We don't know yet what the policies will be on his second term. During Biden's administration, we saw getting back into these international tables, taking more lead. And I think that that's very important because there is bigger fight of values going on in the world between democratic countries, the values that we present, and then the countries that have very different view on the world, the authoritarian countries that are now rising their heads, like Russia, attacking Ukraine, for example, trying to make some kind of new rule-based order in the world and not obeying the ones that we have agreed under the UN together. So I think we need strong presence and strong values from US. And I only hope that US want to become and want to be that kind of international superpower leading with values that we represent as democratic countries.
You actually paved the way for Ukraine to be part of the EU and eventually perhaps NATO. Would that be a game changer for Ukraine? How different would it be for the country?
Well, Ukraine has said themselves that they want to become part of European Union and that they want to become a member in NATO as well. And I think we have to support those aspirations. They want to be part of the democratic West. They don't want to be under Russian influence. And I think we have to support their pathway towards West. They are part of Europe, and I wish to see them part of European Union in the future, building their country as progressive as possible with those democratic values that we believe in. And I think when we look at Finland, we were a poor occurring country just over 100 years ago. We have had so many wars with Russia and we have lost land and lives. But after that, we have been able, as an independent country, to build our country one of the world's most prosperous countries. And we have built a welfare state being part of European Union and now part of NATO. So I only wish the same kind of progressive future for Ukraine. And I want to help in that pathway, paving the way to European Union and hopefully also in NATO in future, because Ukraine has many capabilities when it comes to defense. They are the only European country that have that modern warfare experience, very recent. So I think they would be a strong add to NATO's capabilities in the future.
Sanna, you were the youngest prime minister when you came to power, but you were also the lightning rod for criticisms. You came under a lot of scrutiny. Do you think when you were prime minister, your youth worked against you?
Well, I don't want to think that my youth was against me or my gender. I focused on the issues and the matters, and I'm very proud that even though we faced such a huge crises like global pandemic, the war in Ukraine, energy crisis in Europe, and then Finland's pathway to NATO, we were able, our government was able to fulfill 98% of our governmental program, even though we have to focus also on these crises. So I think we were very effective, and we make big reforms on social and healthcare, on education, on parental leave, equality, and also we made one of the world's most ambitious climate targets, becoming climate neutral already in 2035. So I think that in my case, I want to think that maybe the youth and our young government, we had 5 female leaders. 4 of us were under 40 years old. We also made progressive policies and looked forward.
Sanna, been a pleasure. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Sanna Marin, former Finnish Prime Minister, still to come. Former US House Speaker Kevin McCarthy thinks his political rival, Matt Gaetz, is unlikely to be confirmed. Details when we come back. This is Bloomberg. Well, some headlines to tell you about. China new dollar bond yields almost the same as U.S. Treasuries. Of course, it is its debut. Yields and new China dollar bonds falling below Treasuries in its debut. 3-year USD bond spreads tightening to 24 basis points under Treasuries. 5-year USD bond spreads tightening to 25 basis points under treasuries as well. We'll bring you the very latest as they come along. Now, turning to the U.S., Republicans have held on to their narrow majority in the U.S. House, giving President-elect Donald Trump and his party unified control of the government. Trump's securing of the so-called Washington trifecta strengthens the party's hand when it comes to pushing through major policies, from tax cuts to immigration controls, regulation, and changes to the energy industry. Now, Trump's cabinet also continues to take shape with the nomination of Florida Representative Matt Gaetz to the Attorney General. Gaetz is a Trump ally who could spearhead an ambitious agenda overhauling the Justice Department while targeting immigration as well as crime. Former U.S. House Speaker Kevin McCarthy is hailing Donald Trump's choices for key nominations to his cabinet, all except Gaetz. I spoke with him earlier here at the Barclays Asia Forum.
I think choices are very good except one. Look, Gaetz won't get confirmed. Everybody knows that. But when you look at a Rubio, just the knowledge that he has, being in the Intel Committee, I was on the Gang of Eight, and his understanding, even when you listen to the other side of the aisle, they say, he'll make a great Secretary of State. So that's strong for me. A Waltz, just his background, from a Green Beret and others being the... But John Radcliffe at CIA, former DNI, that's very strong. And the difference is to what was 8 years ago today, President Trump understands the job. He knows the people that he needs around him to get there. And I think he's going to be much better prepared because he only has one term, but he'll hit the ground running this time.
You say Gaetz will not be confirmed.
No.
Why bother with the nomination then?
You can talk to the president, but it's a good...
How are you reading
It's a good deflection from others, but it also gives... I'll let it stand with that.
No, I mean, just provide us some thinking into, what Trump had in mind when he made that nomination. Is it a case of, you win some, lose some? It is a negotiating tactic? What is it?
You'd have to ask the president, but Gaetz couldn't win in a Republican conference, so it doesn't matter.
When you take a look at the nominations so far, I mean, we've seen, China hawks, for instance. Is that an indication of how he will approach the relationship between the U.S. and China?
Look, I think for those world leaders, they have a relationship with President Trump, and I think they're probably thankful that President Trump won. It brings greater stability around the world, but it also says a very clear message that America won't be pushed around. And also when it comes to economic issues like trade and others, this president wants to negotiate. This president wants to have a fair deal. And he can work with anybody, be it the leader of North Korea, and stop testing your missiles and let's sit down and talk. He's willing to sit down and talk to anyone. That's a different approach that I think is much more successful, and I think the world will approach that. Putin never invaded another country while President Trump was in office, and I think those things will stop as well.
My conversation with former U.S. House Speaker Kevin McCarthy here at the Barclays Asia Forum. Now, investors are also focused on Trump's future policies. Some think they could add to inflationary pressures. The latest U.S. CPI data came in line with expectations, but also underscored the slow progress on fighting inflation. Bloomberg's Avril Hong joins us for a closer look. Avril.
Yeah, Has. I mean, you look at the data, core and headline came bang in line with estimates, but look at the details. Headline, annualized 3-month rate back above 2%. It really illustrates this frustrating fight against inflation, and perhaps that's being reflected in those dollar moves. Part of this, of course, is the Trump trade, but you look at the short end performance overnight and how it rallied. I think it speaks to investor confidence about a Fed move in December, a bit of a petering out of that rally in the Asia session. But of course, all this is going to have implications for Asia currencies. And you're seeing Asia currencies today, they're all on the back foot, especially those with economies that are closely tied, heavily dependent on trade, sensitive to the Chinese yuan. The Japanese currency is in focus, of course, as we see at the weakest levels since July 22nd. What's really interesting this time around is how Japanese authorities have been pretty silent in terms of verbal intervention or any pushback against the yen weakness. We have the likes of Tokyo Marine saying dollar-yen could climb to 160 by the end of the year, and they anticipate a hike from the BOJ come January. Now let's take a deeper dive into markets with Bloomberg MLive strategist Mary Nicola. So Mary, it's really all about the data and what we saw overnight with that annualized 3-month rate climbing back above 2%, but somehow it was still enough for the short end of treasuries. Why is that the case? I mean, we still have NFPs, CPI before we get to the December meeting.
You know, one of the key things that we heard from Neil Kashkari, one of the Fed presidents, was that inflation is moving in line with their expectations and we're making progress on disinflation. And that's going to be absolutely critical. We've seen core inflation come bang in line with expectations. But at the same time, we've known that the last mile of inflation is going to be sticky. It's just proving to be a lot stickier than expected. So you did see, you know, that markets came in line in terms of where the 2-year had rallied, but then the back end was the one that sold off. And there's largely an expectation that, yes, the Fed might cut in December, and they've increased the likelihood of it cutting in December. But at the same time, the future thereafter is a little bit more cloudy, especially with what's happening on the political side.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, you mentioned Kashkari, but from the Fed speakers of late, do you get the sense that they are more concerned about inflation than they are about jobs in the US? And does that speak to what they are anticipating from Trump's policies?
I think they still have a dual mandate, and that means that both of them are going to be absolutely critical. So a lot of if they start seeing further cracks in the labor market, their tone is going to shift quite markedly. But so far, if we're looking at inflation and the trajectory of inflation, it is in the way that politics are going, and assuming that the labor market is holding up, they're going to be a lot more worried about inflation than, let's say, 2 months ago, because of the fact that you do now have a trifecta. The Republicans have come in. It's going to be a lot easier to pass these tax cuts that Trump spoke about on the campaign trail. So the budget deficit is likely to get wider. And then at the same time, you could see that inflation, of course, because of tariffs coming through. So you've got trade policy and fiscal policy uncertainty, and that's going to be a clear concern for the Fed.
What is that going to mean for Asia's currencies? Which do you see as the most vulnerable?
Yeah, the thing about Asia is that it's mixed with the group of small open economies, right? And so, of course, total trade to GDP in a place like where we are here in Singapore is as much as 300%. And then if you look at Malaysia and Thailand, they're above 100%, right? And then, of course, you also have Vietnam, which is upwards of 100% as well. So all these countries are very much exposed to trade. So who might be less affected would be someone like Indonesia that's relying more on domestic growth. Same thing with, let's say, India. But at the same time, because you're seeing this like broader sell-off in markets, they're also going to be affected. So their economies, let's say in Indonesia, might hold up relatively well, but their markets might be a very different story because they're all going to move together in sympathy.
There's a disconnect between the markets and the economic trajectory. You talk about India. We saw it in correction just a day ago. What is your sense of the run that we've had this year? Is it just a case of they've gone too far, too fast at the start of the year? Yeah,
I mean, we've had a really impressive run in India, and a lot of that has to do with the fact of where do you go when China's not looking so great, right? And India's got that depth and the breadth of the market. So now that, but then they still have to deliver, and they have to deliver on earnings growth, and they were. But the problem now is that you're seeing earnings revision coming off in India. That earnings season hasn't been that great. So you're actually reconsidering, do the valuations make sense, and should I be in this market? And that's why I think you're starting to see a lot of foreigners really take a step back and consider whether they should maintain their allocation in India.
Where we are seeing a bit of earnings growth also is in Chinese tech. That is really interesting as the first of the big tech names have started reporting. But we're going to have to leave it there for today. Great to have your insights with us. Thanks so much, Mary Nicola of the MLive team. Has?
That's right. Thanks so much for that. Still to come. Former U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry will be joining us live. Hear his thoughts on Donald Trump's latest cabinet appointments and the future of climate policy. Keep it here with us. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back. You're watching Insight with me, Haslinda Amin. Now, U.S. President-elect Donald Trump has returned to the White House for the first time since his chaotic exit 4 years ago. He met with President Joe Biden in the Oval Office to discuss the transition of power.
Politics is tough, and it's, in many cases, not a very nice world, but it is a nice world today, and I appreciate very much a transition that's so smooth. It'll be as smooth as it can get, and I very much appreciate that, Judge.
As we've been discussing, Trump has also announced a flurry of nominations in recent days, including one-time rival and longtime China critic Senator Marco Rubio as his choice for Secretary of State. Well, let's talk about the implications with a former holder of that office, John Kerry. He joins us today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Glad to be with you.
What do you make of the nominations we've seen so far, including that of Marco Rubio?
Well, I like Marco Rubio. I think he's served with him in the Senate. He's a capable guy. I think he'll be able to fill those shoes pretty well.
But what are the challenges? I mean, it does seem like he's putting a lot of China hawks in his cabinet if the nominations come through.
Well, that's his privilege. He won the election. And the fact is that elections have consequences. And now people are seeing some of those consequences. I don't know if they were traveling with a false sense of security or something, but this is pretty much what President Trump said he was going to do. A lot of what I personally find the conjecture just sort of to some degree, a waste of time, because nobody can predict. I think one of the powerful tools former President Trump has at his disposal is unpredictability. And I think he actually has a table that's fairly set for things to transition a little bit. I speak about the Middle East, I speak about Ukraine, trying to end the war there. There especially, I think there are dynamics that many people who analyze it and have followed it feel now might be in play, and that we may really be able to get something different with respect to Ukraine. I think President Bush, there you go. I think that the president will navigate that very carefully, and I think he has some thoughts in mind. Now, I'm not here to say everything's going to sort of fall together. It's tough. These are many negotiations, and former President Trump is known to appreciate the process of negotiating, and there's a lot to negotiate about right now. But I also look and I say, I think that possibly, depending a fair amount on what Prime Minister Netanyahu decides to do and what happens in Israel, but it may be possible here to actually try to work something with Iran, to try to come up with a different dynamic for the region. And that was something that, with President Obama, we actually put on the table towards the end of the administration, was a whole new security arrangement for the region. In fact, with the UAE's significant input and thought, there was an effort that Jake Sullivan pursued and others to try to bring Saudi Arabia to the table, have Saudi Arabia recognize Israel, have Israel move into this new sort of security arrangement. I think that's still, frankly, a possibility, but it depends hugely, if not entirely, on how you approach the question of Gaza, how you begin to deal with the Palestinian future, and there's a lot to nibble on. But it is a table that has been set for negotiation. And I think there's a lot that could change and come out of it.
Let's talk about the flashpoints that you brought up. We talk about the Middle East and how he may shape negotiations there. There's conversations, of course, about how he wants to impose even more sanctions on Iran. I mean, would that work? What would work with Iran? If he wants to negotiate with Iran and, help rectify the situation in the Middle East, how should he go about doing that?
Well, look, again, this is all personal. He's won the right to make the choices as to what he's going to do. But asked by you, I would answer you by saying, I think that diplomacy is also an art, not just, getting into a fight and flexing your muscles and using the great power of our country. But diplomacy makes a difference. President Obama instructed me to engage in that kind of diplomacy, and we came up with an agreement that actually took a nuclear weapon off the table, gone, off the table. And it was off the table for, it would have been a year and 2 months or more for breakout. to have a weapon. Now it's a week. And there's no way you can persuade me that Israel and the region are safer because Iran actually could break out and have a nuclear weapon. Now, do I think they're about to do that? No, I don't. But the fact that and I don't have the intelligence briefing of the latest that says what they're doing, but I suspect that the intel community would agree that they haven't broken out yet, and they might yet be able to be prevented from doing so if there were some sort of overture. It can be back channel, it can be secret, and there are lots of ways. And I have no illusions about how tough that is, because we did it for 4 years. And Iran has been menacing. Clearly, Iran supports Hezbollah. Iran supports the Houthi. Iran supports the Hamas and so forth. And that has to stop. But you've got to begin to talk to somebody. You've got to begin to explore the possibilities. And one of the things I resolved many years ago was, before you send young men and women off to war, before you are empowering the capacity for war, make the efforts. Get caught trying to find if there's a better route before you ask young kids to give up their lives.
As it stands now, do you see the chances of an escalation in the Middle East as it stands now?
As it stands now, there is the possibility of escalation. There's also the possibility of mistaken calculation on one side or the other, or several. These are dangerous parties in some cases. And I think, and Israel suffered on October 7th, something that none of us ever thought we'd see looking back on the history of the Holocaust and other things. That was as racist, as enraged, as brutal, as sexist, as craven as anything any of us have seen in our lifetimes. And so it did deserve a response. The question is, where do you take that response? How do you begin to patch something back together? The Middle East is the least integrated region of the entire world, and it happens to be home of the three great major religions. And the sites and the history that are there for people to begin to open up the vision of peace and begin to talk about working together and living together and building together. The world needs that today more than anything else. We need to get back on a track where we give institutions meaning, where we give relationships meaning, and where we give individual disempowered and disenfranchised people the meaning that they deserve in their lives.
Secretary Kerry, I just want to bring up climate as well. This is the man who pulled the U.S. out of the Paris Agreement. How do you see efforts to fight the climate crisis in the next year? Do you see a dialing back? I mean, are you concerned?
Well, a lot of that depends, let me just say, to some degree, that depends on what President Trump will decide to do. If he pulls out of the Paris Agreement, another 195, 96 countries are going to continue to be in the agreement. And what he will do is cede, if he did that, he would cede leadership to China, the very thing that he says we don't want to do, and he would diminish the ability of the world to be able to respond to this existential crisis. Now, I know people get a little wiggly and, they can't listen to you when you say, oh, this is a really serious issue. I'm trying to figure out why human beings are so wired that they don't want to take an existential challenge at face value. But the new science on what is happening to this planet is frightening. And it's not politics that's producing that information. It's not ideology. It's not some pet project of President Biden or John Kerry. It's the result of what scientists are telling us, and mathematics, physics are documenting what is happening to this planet. We are burning fossil fuel without capturing the emissions. And I'm not per se against the fuel, but you've got to capture the emissions. If we're not capturing them, we continue to do the damage. On the other side of that, addressing that, there's an incredible new world of opportunity. Technologies are coming online right now. AI will be a very critical part of resolving this. Big new grids have to be built to provide energy. We have data centers that need to be built. They need power. We have the ability now to build out some nuclear power to help with that, and geothermal. So there are lots of technologies. Last year, $2 trillion of investment, not spending, went into solving this problem. $2 trillion versus 1 trillion for fossil fuel. So for the first time in history, the marketplace writ large has said, this is where we're going. And I don't believe any one politician anywhere in the world can stop that. In fact, the test for real leadership is how do you channel that? And look at what Darren Woods, the chairman of ExxonMobil, said yesterday. He urged President Trump not to pull out because he thinks it would disadvantage American companies and disadvantage American leadership.
You got to wonder whether China will, assume that leadership role if push comes to shove.
We need to work with China to deal with this problem. And in the doing of that, we can find other avenues and other ways to talk about serious issues that we differ on. There are many issues we differ on with China, and I do join in differing on them. But if you don't talk to people, if you don't engage in a discussion about what's possible or how are you going to respond, if we just slap on a whole bunch more tariffs, life is going to get much more expensive for a whole bunch of folks who actually voted for Donald Trump.
When it comes to the rest of the world, if we have a Trump administration that does not remain committed to the climate call, what should the rest of the world be doing?
Well, the rest of the world is doing. I mean, this is the
What more should they be doing?
Well, everybody needs to speed up. What we need is more speed, bigger size, and more money. We need to actually excite what the Inflation Reduction Act did in the United States was excite a whole bunch of entrepreneurial activity with innovation. We need to do more of that on a global basis, and we'll win the fight. We can win the fight.
Secretary Kerry, always a pleasure. We always run out of time. John Kerry, former U.S. Secretary of State. Now let's take a look at where we are in terms of the market. We're tracking oil, of course, off the back of our conversation. And of course, U.S. futures, lots to consider. Taking a look where we are in terms of Brent crude, currently in negative territory, down about 0.4%. We talked about China. Remember that China is slowing down. Demand for oil is also on the downside. And not forgetting, of course, there's excess supply. And in terms of U.S. futures, this is how it's looking. Of course, the CPI print overnight coming pretty much in line with expectations, an 80% chance of another cut come December. Now, before we go, here's a look at our guest for tomorrow. Let's see who we have for our show tomorrow. We'll discuss the outlook for Vietnamese lenders with the CEO of Techcombank. That's as the industry grows faster than the country's economy. It's been a fascinating conversation here at the Barclays Asia Forum. That is it for Inside Horizons. Middle East and Africa is next. Do keep it here with us. This is Bloomberg.